Let us begin with the one fact that makes this story so dangerous. Not only the amount, not only the timing, but the movement itself. Because in geopolitics, there is a major difference between uranium that exists inside a country and uranium that is suddenly being moved in the middle of tension, pressure, and possible conflict. If reports are correct, then roughly 460 kilograms of uranium enriched to a very high level has now left Iranian control inside Iranian territory. And that changes the meaning of the entire crisis. Now, before we go further, we need to slow this down and understand why this matters. When most people hear the word uranium, they think only of nuclear weapons. But serious strategic analysis requires a more careful view. Uranium at this level is not just a technical asset. It is political leverage. It is military pressure. It is diplomatic currency. It is also a signal, and sometimes the signal is more important than the material itself. That is the first point we need to understand. This story is not only about what Iran has, it is about what Iran may be doing with what it has and why the movement of that material can send shockwaves through every intelligence service, every war room, and every capital following this crisis. Because once such material begins to move, the question changes immediately. The question is no longer, does Iran have leverage? The question becomes, who is about to gain leverage next? That is why this story matters far beyond Tehran. It matters in Washington, it matters in Moscow, it matters in Beijing, it matters in Tel Aviv, it matters in the Gulf. It matters in every place where military planners are now forced to think ahead, not by months, but by hours. And here is the deeper issue. In a nuclear crisis, enrichment level matters, but custody matters too. A stockpile inside a known facility is one kind of problem. It can be watched, it can be monitored, it can be targeted, it can be negotiated over. But once material leaves that fixed environment, even temporarily, the crisis enters a more dangerous phase. Mobility creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates fear. And fear changes state behavior very quickly. That is what we may be looking at now. Reportedly, this is not low-level material. It is uranium enriched to a level that is far above normal civilian use and much closer to the threshold that makes the world nervous. We should be careful with language here. Near weapons grade does not automatically mean a bomb. It does not mean a weapon is about to appear tomorrow. But it does mean something very important. The margin for error becomes much smaller, and the strategic value of the material becomes much higher. This is why intelligence agencies do not treat such movement as routine. When sensitive material moves during a crisis, analysts immediately begin asking three questions. First, who authorized it? Second, who is protecting it? And third, who is meant to receive it? Those three questions tell us more about the future than any official press conference ever will. Because if this transfer is real, then it was not random. It was planned, it was weighed, and it was almost certainly tied to a broader political or military calculation. States do not move strategic nuclear material in moments like this for symbolic reasons. They move it because keeping it where it was has become too dangerous, or because moving it serves a larger purpose. That larger purpose is what we need to understand. There are several possibilities, and each one points in a different direction. One possibility is that this is part of a negotiation, a controlled transfer meant to reduce immediate pressure or prevent a larger escalation. Another possibility is that this is a protective move, a decision to relocate the material before any strike, sabotage operation, or seizure attempt can reach it. And there is a third possibility, the most serious one, that the movement itself is designed to create strategic ambiguity. In other words, the uncertainty is the message. If nobody knows exactly where it is going, then every major power is forced to prepare for the worst possible version of the story. That alone can shift military behavior. Naval patrols change. Satellite monitoring intensifies. Back-channel diplomacy accelerates. Regional allies start making emergency calls. And markets, intelligence services, and military planners all begin reacting to something that may not yet be publicly confirmed, but is already changing calculations. This is why we must not treat this as just another headline from the Middle East. This is not only a story about uranium. It is a story about control. Who controls the material? Who controls the timing? Who controls the next stage of escalation? And perhaps most importantly, who benefits from the world not knowing the answer right away? That is where the real tension begins. Because if 460 kilograms of highly enriched uranium has indeed left Iran, then this is no longer just a question of Iran's nuclear program. It is now a question of regional order, strategic signaling, and the balance of pressure between great powers. And this is the most important conclusion of part 1. Material like this is never moved in isolation. If it is moving, then something else is moving with it: diplomacy, deterrence, military planning, or a new power arrangement that has not yet been revealed. So the destination matters, yes, but the act of movement matters even more, because this was not just transportation, this was a signal. And in moments like this, signals are rarely sent without a second move already in motion. States do not move their most dangerous material when they feel safe. They move it when the ground beneath them is starting to change. And that is the real meaning of this moment. If Iran has decided to let 460 kilograms of highly enriched uranium leave its territory, then this decision was not made in panic alone, and it was not made for show. A move like this would sit at the intersection of military fear, political survival, and strategic timing. In simple words, Iran would only do this if keeping the material inside the country had become riskier than moving it out. That is where we need to begin, because many people will look at this story and immediately jump to one conclusion. They will say, Iran is backing down, Iran is giving in, Iran is losing leverage. But serious analysis requires more discipline than that. Sometimes a state gives up ground because it is weak, and sometimes a state changes position because it wants to protect the one asset that still gives it power. Those are not the same thing. Iran understands that uranium is not just nuclear material, it is bargaining power. It is deterrence. It is a shield made of uncertainty. As long as that stockpile remains inside the country, it creates pressure on every rival watching Iran. But it also creates danger for Iran itself. It becomes a fixed target. It becomes vulnerable to airstrikes, sabotage, cyber disruption, covert seizure, or pressure through negotiations. So if Tehran believes that a new phase of confrontation is approaching, then moving the material may not be surrender. It may be preservation. That is the key idea in this part. Iran may not be trying to abandon leverage. Iran may be trying to store leverage in a safer place or convert it into diplomatic time. And diplomatic time matters in crises like this. Because when a state is under military pressure, the first goal is not always to win immediately. Sometimes the goal is to delay the next blow. Sometimes it is to break the enemy's rhythm. Sometimes it is to force the other side to pause, rethink, or negotiate under new conditions. Moving uranium can do exactly that. Why? Because once the material is no longer sitting in a known place inside Iran, the military logic changes. The enemy cannot simply plan around one target set. Intelligence agencies must update assumptions. Diplomats must ask new questions. Allies must review risks. The timeline becomes less clear. And in war, uncertainty can be as valuable as strength. Now let us go deeper. Iran also has a domestic problem to manage. No Iranian leadership can afford to look like it is handing over its most sensitive strategic asset under pressure from foreign powers. That would look like humiliation. It would damage the regime's image at home. It would raise doubts inside the military establishment. And it would tell the public that years of sacrifice, sanctions, and strategic patience ended in open retreat. That is politically dangerous. So if uranium is moving, Tehran would almost certainly want the move to look different. Not surrender, but repositioning. Not defeat, but temporary transfer. Not capitulation, but a controlled step inside a larger strategic arrangement. This distinction is extremely important because states do not only manage threats from outside, they also manage perceptions inside their own system. Iran must think about its armed forces, its political elites, its parliament, its clerical structure, and its population. Every one of those audiences interprets a nuclear move differently. This means the transfer, if real, must serve two purposes at once. Externally, it reduces immediate danger or creates diplomatic space. Internally, it protects the image of resistance and control. That is not easy to do. But it is exactly the kind of balancing act governments attempt when they are under maximum pressure. There's another reason Iran might move now: fear of losing the material altogether. If Tehran believes that strikes on its nuclear infrastructure are becoming more likely, or that covert operations are getting closer, then the calculation becomes cold and simple. Better to move the material on your own terms than lose it on the enemy's terms. Better to relocate it in a controlled way than wake up one morning and discover that the strategic heart of your deterrent has been damaged, seized, or exposed. This is why timing matters so much. A transfer like this does not happen in a political vacuum. It happens when leaders believe a threshold is near. Maybe that threshold is military. Maybe it is diplomatic. Maybe it is internal. But something in the environment has changed enough to make stillness more dangerous than movement. And here is the deeper suspense. Iran may not even be moving this material to end a crisis. It may be moving it to survive the next stage of the crisis. that possibility changes everything. Because if this is part of a peace track, then the movement is a concession with purpose. But if this is part of a survival track, then the movement is a preparation, not for calm, but for escalation. And that is why outside observers must be careful. A state under pressure often hides its real objective behind a technical act. A shipment can look administrative, a transfer can look diplomatic, a relocation can sound temporary. But under the surface, the move may be buying time, protecting capability, reshaping negotiations, and forcing every rival to guess what comes next. So the real question is not simply why Iran would move the uranium. The real question is what kind of future Iran believes is coming so soon that moving it now has become necessary. Because what looks like retreat from a distance can, at close range, look very much like strategic repositioning. And once you understand that, the next question becomes unavoidable. If Iran has chosen to move the material now, then who is important enough, trusted enough, and powerful enough to receive it? The moment uranium leaves its point of origin, the center of gravity shifts. Until that moment, the story belongs to Iran. After that moment, the story belongs to whoever is waiting on the other side. And this is where the crisis becomes more dangerous, because once the material is in motion, the question is no longer about enrichment alone. It becomes a question of custody. And in geopolitics, custody is not a technical detail. Custody is influence. Custody is access. Custody is control over the next conversation, the next bargain, and possibly the next war. So now we arrive at the most sensitive part of the story. Who could actually receive material like this? To answer that, we need to think like a strategist, not like a headline writer. A possible recipient must meet several conditions at the same time. It must have the technical ability to handle sensitive nuclear material. It must have a political relationship with Iran strong enough to make the transfer possible. It must be powerful enough to absorb international pressure. And above all, it must gain something valuable by becoming part of this chain. Because no serious state steps into a crisis like this for charity. It does so for leverage. The first and most obvious category is a major power, a state with nuclear infrastructure, diplomatic reach, and the ability to protect the transfer from becoming immediate chaos. This kind of actor would not just store uranium, it would transform itself into a necessary player in the crisis. Once that happens, every future negotiation would have to pass through it. Every inspection debate, every sanctions discussion, every military calculation would suddenly depend on that state's cooperation. That is why the identity of the recipient matters so much. The receiver does not merely hold material. The receiver gains a seat at the center of the table. And that seat can change the balance of power far beyond the Middle East. Now think about the logic from Iran's side. Iran is unlikely to send such material to a state it deeply distrusts. That would turn the transfer into surrender. It would hand a strategic asset directly to an adversary and hope that promises are honored later. States under pressure do not usually make that kind of move unless they have no choice. And if Iran still has options, then trust, or at least structured alignment, becomes essential. This is why the field of possible recipients becomes narrower than many people assume. Some countries may have the laboratories, the storage systems, and the scientific expertise, but not the political courage. They may not want the diplomatic storm that would follow. Others may have the political will, but not the technical systems required for secure and credible custody. Some may be close enough to Iran to discuss such an arrangement, but too exposed to sanctions, surveillance, or regional retaliation to carry it out safely. So the real pool is small, and that is exactly why this transfer, if true, would matter so much. Because when the pool is small, every possible destination has global meaning. A trusted great power recipient would signal one kind of future, a world in which Iran protects its leverage by placing it inside a friendly strategic umbrella. A monitored third-party arrangement would signal something else, a world in which diplomacy is still alive, but only through layered compromise and indirect trust. And then there is the darker possibility that the uncertainty is not a side effect. It is the strategy. If the material is dispersed, rerouted, or moved through a chain designed to confuse observers, then the lack of clarity becomes a weapon by itself. Intelligence agencies would have to spend precious time sorting signals from deception. Rival militaries would have to prepare for multiple scenarios. Diplomats would speak more urgently, but with less confidence. The ambiguity would create paralysis, and paralysis, in moments like this, can be power. This is what many people miss. In high-stakes geopolitical crises, not knowing can be as destabilizing as knowing. If the world cannot identify the recipient quickly, then every major actor is forced to imagine the version of the story that threatens it most. One capital imagines a hostile alliance growing stronger. Another imagines inspections collapsing. Another imagines a precedent that weakens the entire non-proliferation system. And once governments begin planning around worst-case assumptions, the crisis starts expanding beyond the original event. That is how a transfer becomes a strategic shockwave. Now let us go one level deeper. Why would a recipient want this role at all? Because taking custody of such material creates dependence. It means Iran depends on you. It means the international community must speak to you. It means your technical agencies, your diplomats, and your security system become part of the solution or part of the problem. That is an extraordinary position to occupy. And the state that steps into that position can use it to gain status, concessions, bargaining power, and long-term influence over the shape of the settlement that follows. In other words, receiving the uranium is not only about the uranium, it is about becoming indispensable. That may be the most important sentence in this entire part. Because once one actor becomes indispensable to the nuclear question, it may also become indispensable to the war question, the sanctions question, the energy question, and the diplomatic question. A single transfer can rearrange the political map without a single missile being fired. And that is why part 3 is not really about guessing a destination. It is about understanding what kind of power is created when strategic material changes hands, or even appears to. So here is the conclusion we are left with. The recipient matters because custody creates influence. The ambiguity matters because uncertainty creates pressure. And the transfer matters because it may already be redrawing the diplomatic map before the world even confirms where the uranium has gone, which means the real danger is larger than one shipment. Because once material like this begins to move, every state watching begins to recalculate its own future. The most dangerous geopolitical events are not always the loudest. Sometimes they begin with movement, quiet movement, material move from one place to another, and then slowly the world begins to move with it. That is where this story leads in the end. Because the real significance of 460 kilograms of near weapons-grade uranium leaving Iran is not limited to Iran itself. The deeper danger is what other states learn from it, what rival powers conclude from it, and how the entire international system begins adjusting around a single act of strategic ambiguity. This is how local crises become global turning points. If a state under maximum pressure can use highly enriched uranium not only as a deterrent, but as a bargaining tool, a survival tool, and a way to reshape diplomacy, then every serious government watching will take note. Not because they all want nuclear weapons tomorrow, but because they will study the lesson hidden inside the event. And the lesson may be simple. In a world of pressure, sanctions, air power, covert action, and collapsing trust, strategic material still creates leverage. That lesson matters far beyond the Middle East. Because once that idea spreads, the logic of restraint begins to weaken. States that rely on outside security guarantees may begin asking themselves a harder question. If even major powers cannot fully protect the interests of their partners, then what is the real insurance policy in an unstable world? Is it alliances? Is it diplomacy? Or is it the ability to move quickly toward nuclear capability without fully crossing the line until the last possible moment? That is where the future becomes dangerous. Because nuclear crises do not spread only through weapons. They also spread through example. One country watches another survive pressure and begins to think differently about what it may one day need for itself. That is how regional calculations change. A country that once believed conventional defense was enough may begin to value nuclear latency, the ability to develop the option quickly if the strategic environment worsens. Another may increase missile programs, underground infrastructure, air defense networks, or long-term enrichment research. Another may not pursue a bomb at all, but may begin building the technical and industrial foundation that gives it a credible threshold position. And once several countries begin thinking that way at the same time, the problem becomes much larger than one uranium transfer. It becomes a crisis of the whole non-proliferation system. Because the global order depends not only on treaties and inspections, but on belief. Belief that the system can still control escalation. Belief that agreements still have meaning. Belief that crossing nuclear thresholds brings more risk than reward. But if states begin to conclude that ambiguity protects, that threshold capability deters, and that strategic material can be converted into bargaining power during war, then that belief starts to crack. And once belief cracks, rules become harder to enforce. This is where the military consequences also begin to grow. If the destination of this uranium remains uncertain, or if the recipient becomes part of a larger power struggle, then intelligence services will not remain passive. Surveillance will intensify, naval routes will face greater scrutiny, signals intelligence, satellite monitoring, cyber operations, and covert networks will all shift into higher gear. Regional militaries will review contingency plans, air defense systems will be repositioned, Missile calculations will change. States will begin preparing not for the version of events they prefer, but for the version they fear most. That is what instability really looks like. Not one dramatic moment, but many institutions moving at once because they no longer trust the strategic environment around them. And the economic consequences follow quickly behind. Energy markets are highly sensitive to uncertainty in the Gulf. Shipping routes react to risk. Insurance costs rise. Strategic reserves become part of national planning. Governments that have nothing directly to do with Iran still begin adjusting, because global energy flows, investor confidence, and military risk are all connected. A transfer like this can therefore affect countries far from the immediate theater, not because they are involved in the nuclear issue itself, but because the entire structure of geopolitical risk becomes more unstable. And then there is the final consequence, the psychological one. Because once strategic material begins moving in secrecy, every major power begins wondering what else is moving with it. Is diplomacy moving toward a hidden deal? Is deterrence moving toward a new balance? Is military escalation already entering its next phase? That uncertainty has power. It creates hesitation in some capitals, panic in others, and opportunity for those prepared to exploit confusion. So when we return to the title of this story, we should understand it differently now. The danger is not only that nobody knows where the uranium is going. The deeper danger is that the movement itself is already changing state behavior before the destination is even confirmed. That is why this story matters. Because once uranium of this kind leaves its original position under crisis conditions, the world does not wait for final proof before reacting. Governments start recalculating immediately. Militaries start planning immediately. Diplomats begin speaking in quieter, sharper language. And rival powers begin testing whether this moment can be turned into long-term advantage. So the real story is not only about one shipment. It is about the kind of world that follows such a shipment. A world where threshold states gain more influence, where alliances are tested more harshly, where non-proliferation loses moral clarity, and where strategic ambiguity becomes one of the most valuable weapons in international politics. That is the final conclusion. The destination of the uranium may still be hidden, but the consequences of its movement are already visible everywhere. And once the world begins moving in response, there is no guarantee it can easily move back.